Hi, this is your host, and today we're going to talk about the Old West. Now, in my head, when I think of the Old West, I think of cowboys riding horses, herding cattle, the sound of a lone piano in a saloon, the smell of manure in the streets, maybe some six-shooters blazing away at high noon. But you know what else was around during the Old West? Bounty hunters. You didn't see them in many gunfights, but they were out there. And these men did some very important work in helping to settle the American frontier. So the question is, what was a bounty hunter and why did they do it? Well, first off, let's define our terms. When people are talking about the Old West, they are usually referring to the period of American history between the mid-1860s and the end of the 19th century. This was a time of big changes in America. The country was growing quickly, and new states were being added to the Union. People were moving west in large numbers to claim land and start new lives. Some were running from their past. Others just wanted to be a part of something bigger than themselves. There was also gold to be mined out west. So everyone picked up and headed west. As people moved into these new territories, they brought with them all the problems that had been plaguing the eastern states for decades. There was crime and violence. Sometimes entire gangs would move west. Land disputes were common as settlers staked their claims. And before long, saloons and gambling halls sprang up to help people blow all their money. So who were the people that kept order in these unruly settlements? Some were lawmen, appointed sheriffs or marshals trying to keep the peace, but there were others who did the same job without getting paid by the government. These were the bounty hunters. In most towns, the sheriff or other law enforcement officer couldn't pay his deputies or even offer them enough money to live on. So these men often did their jobs for free. They made their money by collecting a bounty on criminals. But what exactly was a bounty? Well, it was a reward offered by the government for bringing a wanted person to justice. Each state had its own laws and set its own bounties, so it varied from place to place. Sometimes the bounty was just a few dollars. Other times it was enough money to buy a farm. Usually it was set for crimes like rape, murder, or arson. But sometimes the government would even put a price on someone's head if they were just plain ore. What exactly did a bounty hunter do? Well, it sounds pretty simple. Track down the criminal and bring him back alive or dead. But it wasn't as easy as it sounds. First of all, most bounty hunters weren't working for the government. They worked for whoever offered the bounty. That could be a private citizen who had lost money in a gambling hall fire or the state government looking for a notorious outlaw. It was a strange mix of public and private enforcement, and bounty hunters weren't always the most honest people. Some have been known to kill innocent people just to collect the bounty. Others worked with criminals to collect double rewards. If a man was charged with a crime he didn't commit, he might find himself arrested by a deputy, taken to jail, then bailed out by a friend only to find a bounty hunter hot on his trail. But not all bounty hunters were bad guys. Many were former lawmen who had seen better days. Some were just regular citizens who got sick of all the crime and violence. What they all had in common was a willingness to break the law if it meant collecting a bounty. After all, they weren't working for the government. They worked for themselves. And they came from all walks of life. Some were former soldiers, others were frontiersmen or mountain men. Some had been outlaws themselves and knew how to hunt down a criminal. But no matter where they came from, they all had one thing in mind: catching criminals and collecting their bounties. The job was dangerous. Not only were criminals desperate and sometimes violent, but bounty hunters were often hired to capture Native Americans. And these tribes were fierce fighters. Despite the danger, though, many men were willing to take the job. After all, the rewards were high and the work was exciting. To be a bounty hunter, you had to be tough and resourceful. You lived by your wits and your gun, and you had to be willing to do whatever it took to get your man. You tracked them through forests and deserts, across rivers and mountains. You followed their every move until you finally cornered them. Then it was up to you to make the arrest. It wasn't easy, but it was rewarding. When you finally brought your man to justice, you collected your bounty and moved on to your next assignment. You were a bounty hunter, An outlaw catcher, a law unto yourself. Now, bounty hunters didn't just operate in the Old West. The practice dates back to colonial times. In fact, it was used in every state until the early 20th century. But the Old West was probably the most famous era for bounty hunting. It was a time when the frontier was being settled and new laws were being established. Crime and violence were rampant and the government couldn't handle it all. So they turned to bounty hunters. These men and women were the first line of defense against outlaws and lawlessness. They were the ones who kept the peace while the rest of the country was trying to catch up. And they did it for a variety of reasons. Some were motivated by the money. Others wanted to help establish the rule of law. Still others just couldn't sit idly by while criminals ran rampant. Bounty hunting was a dangerous job. It required courage, skill, and determination. But those who did it were rewarded with more than just money. They were able to play a vital role in shaping the future of the American frontier. Now, bounty hunters aren't the only ones who helped to settle the American frontier. There were also homesteaders who braved the hardships of life on the prairie. And then there were the Native Americans who were forced to move from their ancestral lands. And speaking of Native Americans, if you want to learn more about the Native Americans of the Old West, click here. Or if you want to learn more about homesteaders on the American frontier, click here. So who were the most famous bounty hunters of the Old West? Well, there were plenty of them, and it's hard to choose just a few. But here are a couple of names you may have heard before. Dempsey's father was killed by an outlaw when Dempsey was just a baby. He grew up hearing stories about his father and vowed to avenge his death. As a young man, he became a Texas Ranger and spent years tracking down outlaws. But it was his work as a bounty hunter that made him famous. He was said to have captured or killed more than 1,000 outlaws during his career, including the infamous Billy the Kid. Then there was Pat Sugra. He was born in Ireland and came to the United States in 1848. He joined the California Gold Rush but didn't find any gold. He did find work as a bounty hunter and spent the rest of his life tracking down criminals. He was said to have collected more than $100,000 in bounties, which was a fortune in those days. But maybe the most famous bounty hunter of all was the man known as Judge Roy Bean. He was a real judge, but he also worked as a bounty hunter and gambler. He was said to have hanged more than 300 people during his career, but he was never convicted of a crime. In fact, he was considered a hero by many because he brought justice to areas of Texas that had no law enforcement. So there you have it, a look at the bounty hunters of the Old West. They were a rough and tumble bunch, but they played an important role in helping to settle the American frontier. They were the original law enforcement officers, and they deserve our respect, if not our admiration. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe so you can be notified when we release our next video. Until then, stay safe, and we'll see you on the next one.